Audio Jungle. Audio Jungle.
The X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Charles Hugh Smith. Charles is a financial writer, a book author. Charles, the creator of OF2Minds.com, and I am very happy to have Charles back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Charles, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.
Hey, it's always a pleasure to have you on the Spotlight. And I wanted to start off with what is going on out in the UK. Right now, the Brexit was voted down. Parliament said no. And it was like, a margin of 230 votes or something, which is, I think, the biggest we've ever seen. They had a no confidence vote with May, but she narrowly escaped that. What is happening with the Brexit deal? Do you think the EU is going to negotiate a new Brexit deal? What do you think the strategy is here going forward?
Well, Dave, that's a great question, and I'm not well placed enough to know what's going on in the circles of power in Brussels or London. But my context for trying to understand what's going on is Brexit is the deplorables in England and Great Britain, right? And so it's generating very similar emotions to Trump and the Trump voters, i.e. the deplorables in the U.S., and then the tremendous backlash of the establishment, the powers that be, the neoliberal elites that are in charge, that they are really desperate to destroy the political uprising of the deplorables, and we see this in France as well too, right? That the yellow vests, gilets jaunes, they are the deplorables of France. They're routinely hated and loathed and condemned by all the establishment in France, right? That the pundits, the intellectual political structure. So we're seeing, I think, a general uprising against the neoliberal elites in across the world, at least in the three countries we're talking about now. And I think you could argue that Germany is farther down that road than most people understand.
So with the Brexit, do you think their plan is to have a new referendum? You think that the EU would like the people to vote again, but actually maybe manipulate the vote so they say, oh, look, this time they really don't want it and they don't want the Brexit? Do you think that's what they're trying to do here?
I think that's definitely one avenue they're pursuing, because if they can get the thing on the ballot again and ramp up all of their propaganda, right, which we already know from the first Brexit vote what it'll be. You're voting for the economic ruin of Great Britain. You're voting racist, anti-immigration, and you're basically a truly awful person in every way, shape, and form if you vote for Brexit. That's the line of. It really is, Dave. It's like the Cultural Revolution in China. I really think we're seeing that in the West now. And in the Cultural Revolution, which started about 1966 and ran for about 10 years, it basically destroyed China from the inside, because what happened was there was this cultural movement of the Red Guards and so on, that it was like all or nothing. You either met their standards or you were denounced, and then you were often put under house arrest, put in prison, or beaten up and killed. And so we're not, I think culturally we're in the same thing. Whereas if you don't agree with the neoliberal elites that are running things, then you are ostracized and marginalized. And if you happen to be in a demonstration, then you're going to be hit with a water cannon, truncheoned, or otherwise beaten up, and so that's where we're at. And so I can, in that context, then getting a Brexit vote redone that does what the neoliberal elites want. That's one avenue. The other avenue is to try to punish Britain, to punish those bad deplorables who voted for Brexit. And so if the EU can punish Britain enough economically, cut them off at the knees, then they can force, the idea being, I think, to force Great Britain to come back on bended knee and accept whatever terms the EU imposes. But on the other side of the coin, the EU is falling apart. With Merkel no longer in charge in Germany, really, she's a lame duck. Italy in the usual turmoil, Spain in turmoil, France in turmoil. In a way, you could argue that Great Britain is negotiating with a dead organization. The EU claims to have all this power, but it's actually falling apart at the seams. And so from the point of view of people who favor Brexit, really maybe what they need to do is just kind of hang on and then let the EU come apart at the seams.
Yeah, you mentioned France and the Yellow Vests and how they're protesting, and Macron is trying to come up with some type of deal so they could stop protesting because they don't want this at all. But what I see happening is that with the protests going on and spreading across Europe, it's exposing what Macron, what Merkel, what all these individuals are really about. Because if you really think about it, the people are hitting the they want and what they don't like, and it seems like these people they don't even care. They don't even care what they're saying. And they don't care that, it's hard for them, that they have all these taxes and we're not making enough money and everything else. And it seems like they're not really listening. They're just coming out and saying, listen, if you don't do what we say, we're going to send in the police. We're going to send in this. We're going to do this. And that's how it's going to be. So it seems like, I'm sorry, let me just finish one sec. It seems like we're going back, way back in time when we had the serfs and royalty and the people, they were taxed, land was taken away. And finally they went out and they just, said enough is enough.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I've written about, France in particular has a long history of general strikes and large scale, in the streets kind of rebellion. Unlike the U.S. And Britain, which are, the population of, in the streets kind of rebellion. Unlike the U.S. And Britain, which are, the populations are much more passive, I think, in general. And so I was talking about the last time that a general strike in France almost brought the government there to its knees, which was 50 years ago in 1968. The student and public, the unions and the students created this huge, basically shut down Paris. And I was talking about that, and some readers said, no, it's more like 1789. In other words, the French Revolution, which is like what you're referring to. And I think you're absolutely dead on in that. And I often use the term neo-feudal to describe the situation we have now. And I also want to pick up on something else you said, which is that the people who are being dismissed as the deplorables, they are not by the government that's in power. They don't really have any representation. And I was reading an article by a French author, and he said, really, the Yellow Vest and Brexit and voting for Trump, these are all ways of responding to being politically invisible. And I think that's another guy, another author, Francis Fukuyama, he came out and said the same thing too, which is, a great many people, in fact, even the majority of these citizenry feel politically invisible. They have no representation.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, right now we have France and Germany. I mean, let me just go back for a sec here. EU is a bunch of non-elected individuals that are controlling the European nations. And they don't want to lose power because, they're not elected, first of all, and they're telling, the countries what to do. They're passing certain laws. And I feel like they're very nervous and afraid with this movement, not just in Europe, but around the world. They feel very threatened right now. And I think that they're going to try to do whatever they possibly can to try to stop this movement. I mean, do you see that?
I do. I think definitely there's fear and desperation. And another blogger, Chris Martinson, he went and screenshot all the major media, both major newspapers in Paris, and also the London papers, and in New York, here in the U.S. And there was not a single word on any of the front pages about the yellow vest demonstrations, which are in week 9. They're still very 50% of the speed cameras throughout France. They've sabotaged the speed cameras, because that's widely seen as a ripoff of the working class, right? Like you get an automatic ticket in the mail, and it's really expensive, just like here in the States, right?
Yeah.
And in other words, it's just another grab by the government out of the pockets of people who aren't really doing that well, So the yellow vest response is sabotage the bloody things, and so it's clearly happening, and yet the media is imposing basically 100% censorship on it. You're not going to find any reporting from the corporate media or the state media about the yellow vests. And that tells you something right there, because of course the media is part of the neoliberal, political leadership elites, right? It's all one system. So it's not surprising, but it shows how desperate they are, that they can't even talk about it. They have to censor the whole thing. And that's ironically, that's part of what is upsetting to people in some of these countries, is if the consequences of the huge influx of migrant immigrants, right, has created a lot of crime and social disorder, as a result of that influx, and yet that you can't talk about that, and the media ignores that in these countries, right? You're not going to hear about crime created by migrant immigrants, because that's a no-no. So we see this sort of double. It's like there's two societies and two economies, right? If you're in the neoliberal elite economy and you work for the French government, then you get 200,000 euros a year, and if you're not in the elite and you're a yellow vest, you might make 25 or 30,000 euros. And so, and you don't have any political representation, and what you do is censored. So, it's like there's two systems in play, and it's like you said, it's really like the serfs and the royalty, or the gentry class, and so there's two sets of laws, there's two sets of media, there's two economies. One's doing really poorly, one's doing fantastic. And just I'll end with a comment that this French author I referred to earlier, he is a geographer, and he's basically saying all the wealth is in Paris, right? Paris creates the financialization and the globalization wealth, which feeds the government and the corporations there. And he said they don't really, the wealthy in Paris, they don't even need the rest of the country. That's why they don't really care what happens to the yellow vests or deplorables. It's like they don't need them to generate the yellow vests or deplorables. It's like they don't need them to generate their wealth. They just need them to stay out of the way. And that's like neo-feudalism.
So they don't need them as workers? I mean, what are they doing? They're just playing with the free money and speculating and investing. They don't need the workers. They don't need people to work in the factories. They don't need people to work at these jobs. They don't need these people at all?
That's an interesting question. And, it's so unlike the capitalist model that we're used to, which in the classic case, like Andrew Carnegie or Rockefeller or these robber barons of the 19th century and early 20th century, they needed hundreds of thousands of warm bodies doing the work in their foundries and factories and oil refineries and so on, right? And so that led to a labor movement, because the workers actually had power, right? They were needed in order to generate those fortunes. But as you intimate, it's really not the case anymore. It's all about speculation, borrowing money from your central bank at almost zero, buying stocks and basically buying income streams with nearly free money. And this French geographer said in Paris, the wealthy class actually wants the immigrants, because they're the ones who do the dirty work, right? The construction, they're the waiters, and the truck drivers and all of that stuff. So they don't really need anybody outside Paris, as long as they have a poor, desperate to work immigrant class, they're fine. That's all they need. They just need servants and immigrants to do the remodeling work on their mansions and so on. And so it really does raise the question, even in my mind, in the UK and in America, do the super control the political organization? Do they even need most of us? And if the answer is no, well, then it helps explain why they don't want us to be represented in our government.
No, that is true. And also there's many of us, and I think they're nervous and afraid of a movement like this, because once you get a movement moving along, and of course this is why the mainstream media and nobody's reporting it, because they don't want other countries, other people to look at this and say, hey, I want to join in on this. I want to get involved. And that's why they're doing a total censorship of the entire thing. But this is a movement that is actually grassroots. More and more people are joining. More and more people are becoming aware. And we can see even countries where we talked about immigration, you just spoke about that, where they're deciding not to join the UN Migrant Pact. There's a lot of countries that are backing out of it. And even here in the United States, with Trump talking about a wall, talking about immigration, talking about the illegal aliens, talking about coming over with drugs, human trafficking, that was all hidden from the public for a very, very long time. And I believe it's happening here in the U.S., it's happening in Europe, where people are starting to recognize what the elite have been trying to do, where they're trying to bring in all these illegal aliens and put them into different positions where the jobs are very, very low paying, where they're working for them, and actually maybe they can even vote for the candidate, because they got them these low-paying jobs and they're desperate, like you said. So I think countries, people, everyone's starting to become aware of what is going on here, and I think they're very nervous and afraid of an awakening.
I think you're absolutely right. And one of the elements of the Yellow Vest movement, which is a little different than Brexit, is that it doesn't really have a leadership. It's really a self-organizing movement, as you say, and so the self-organizing movement, as you say, and so the political establishment in France is having a very difficult time suppressing it, because if it was a trade union issue, then they could just give the members 20% raises or something, and then they could we would go away, right? And or if it was a couple of student leaders, the French equivalent of some radical group, they could just arrest those few leaders, and then the thing would go away, right? But in a self-organizing movement like the Yellow Vest, there's nobody to negotiate with, and so there's no off button for the establishment. There's no way to turn this thing off. And you mentioned like Macron and as an example of the technocrat class there, and I think it's true of the technocrat class everywhere in the West, and even in China and Japan, really in East Asia as well, is that they've lost touch with the average person. They don't feel their pain. They don't feel their invisibility. And so their response is literally like, let them eat cake, right? The classic. Actually, I think she said let them eat brioche, right? But it's close enough. And so the establishment is failing on two fronts. Number one, they can't find who to buy off or imprison to make it go away. And then number two, their responses are so tone deaf, that they're not really offering what people want, which is actual political representation and one rule of law, one economy, one media for everybody, not like one that censors me but lets somebody else have a say, and a political system that lets somebody else have the power and I have none, and an economy where somebody else skims 90% of the wealth being generated and I get like movement we have everywhere. And so you before we started recording, you mentioned the movement in the top circles of France and Germany to quickly unite their militaries and their infrastructure and their border guards and all this stuff. And it's you and I both agreed that it smacks of a desperation. Like they realize that the game of so-called European integration is unraveling, and they're trying to wrap it up and make it institutionalize it before they lose complete control. But I think it's already beyond their their ability to suppress it.
Do you think this will turn into a full-blown like revolution in these countries where they oust the leaders?
I think it's entirely possible in France. Now let me just explain why I think that. And my brother's lived in France. He's married to a French woman. He's lived there for decades, and he lived in Paris. His in-laws live in Paris, and then they moved to the south in the rural years ago. So I've visited both rural France and urban France, and there's the French have their own. They're quite attached to their culture, right? And a lot of people find that kind of prickly or annoying, and that's understandable, right? But we all cling to what we feel is unique about our culture, right? And so you can't say, oh, well, let's just dissolve all cultures, and it should all be open borders, and everybody, should be exactly the same kind of culture. Now, that would really decimate humanity's variety and self rule, right? So in any event, I'm getting around to the point that the French have a long history with Germany. Like outside of my brother's village, there's a plaque which lists the young men who were murdered by the Germans. And the young men who were murdered by the Germans in World War II for so-called subversive activity. These were not soldiers. They were not in uniform. They did not get a trial. They were just dragged out of town and shot in the head by the Gestapo. And so every village in France has something like that. It's just like every town in France has a memorial to the World War I, which decimated France. And so the idea that the German army is going to come in and take over and share the water cannons and truncheons of the riot police in Paris, that is not going to go over in France. They have memories, of what the Germans did to them the last couple times they were in France. And so, and I'm not sure that the Germans want to get involved in trying to defend the French elites either, because of Eastern Germany, right? The fantasy that we've been told all these decades is, the Eastern Germany is now completely integrated with Western Germany. But it's not that easy. There are actually a lot of people in Eastern Germany feel closer culturally to Poland and the Eastern European countries than they do to France. And so Germany's actually got its own fractures. They're just not as public yet as the Yellow Vests. But yeah, I think France, a lot of people in France feel that they're basically in the beginning of a civil war there.
We see this all happening around the world. I mean, even here in the United States, just the same thing's happening here with the mainstream media. I mean, they report on one side, they make up a lot of, fake stories. And well, here they're not even reporting on the Yellow Vests. They don't even really mention it at all. But with here in this country, we see almost the same thing happening where there are hate on one side against Trump and the mainstream media is completely against Trump. I mean, that's completely obvious. And I see the same thing happening, but in reverse, actually, where in France, the mainstream media, they're kind of for Macron. Here, the mainstream media is against Trump. So we have kind of the opposite happening here.
That's an excellent point. And it kind of goes to show that it's whoever is against the political establishment, the ruling elites, then they're going to be pounded on by the media, and they're going to have the full impact of what I call like this neo-feudal system we're talking about, where there's two sets of laws, right? And that's what we really have here in the States too, is that we have two sets of everything. We've got two economies. If you're on the outs, two sets of everything. We've got two economies. If you're on the outs, if you're not in the economy that's benefiting from Federal Reserve policy and speculative, wealth being generated out of nothing, you're losing out to globalization and financialization. Your life is worse, right? You have less security, less income, less purchasing power. and less opportunity. And so we have two economies. Then we have two sets of laws, because like if you're a rich kid and you get caught with drugs, you get a wrist slap or something. And then if you're a poor person, you get a 10-year sentence in a prison. you know, so it's like we have two sets of laws. And then we have two sets of media. You know, there's you and I and the rest of the alternative media that tries to provide a diversity of opinion. And then there's the corporate media and the state media, which is all one-sided. So is engaged in a mass campaign of censorship. And that talking about it, it's really coming to the fore with the yellow vests. It's like censorship across the entire Western world's media against the yellow vests. And there's a cultural equivalent, you know. In other words, like this French author that was talking about the yellow vests, he says, you know, there's no actor, there's no entertainer, there's no intellectual that's coming out to defend the yellow vests. In other words, the cultural elite is also all one-sided. And that's the same here in the States, too. The cultural elite is all against the deplorables and anti-Trump. But it's not clear that they're for anything except an exploitive, neo-feudal, economy and society. Is that what they're for?
Yeah.
And that's what they're for. That's what they're for. But nobody wants to cop to that, you know, because if that would be kind of admitting what nobody wants to say, which is, yes, I'm actually really exploitive, predatory system because I'm benefiting from it.
Yeah, I agree. And you know what's very interesting is that, I mean, I've never seen this in the past, but the mainstream media, and we always talk about recession. We always talk about the economy. We always talk about things behind the scenes. I'm not talking about the stock market or the unemployment numbers. We talked about that and how they're manipulated. But what's very interesting, I've never seen the mainstream media come out, and there's many articles on this, where they're all saying the same thing, that we're going to have a recession in 2020. 2019, everything's going to start to slow, and they know the exact year that the recession is going to begin, and that is going to be 2020, which happens to coincide with the elections, which is very interesting in itself. But it's just very interesting how they all, you know, are reporting the same exact thing on when this recession is going to happen. I don't find this a coincidence. Do you?
No, that's an excellent observation. And so what's the setup here? You know, what are we being fed and why are we being fed it? And of course, you, as we're talking about, since the media is anti-Trump and anti-deplorable, it's not too hard to imagine that the setup is to create a recession or exacerbate a recession in an election year, so that for sure Trump and his allies will lose, because you know it's gonna reflect very poorly on them that the economy is in recession. And then the other point that you're bringing up is, well, wait a minute, all the statistical data we have from around the world, especially China, is the global economy is already entering recession right now, not a year from now. So that's not being reported or being told because it doesn't fit the narrative that's being pushed.
Right. And this is not something that's new. It's not like, oh, the recession just came out of nowhere. This was since going back to the financial crisis of 2008, where they created this illusion. What we're seeing, which I think we're seeing, is a complete breakdown of the central bank system right now, where everything's starting to slow and we're starting to see everything starting to implode on itself.
Absolutely. And I call it like debt exhaustion. In other words, everybody that could borrow for a legitimate reason has already borrowed. And so all you're left with is really marginal borrowers who really don't have any they don't really have the ability to borrow the money, or you're lending money to marginal corporations, zombie corporations, or you're creating a lot of really marginal debt, junk bonds and that kind of thing, that where the odds of the borrower defaulting are really high. And then we saw that with the subprime thing. And so it's as you say, it is a credit cycle, and you can't really force that to keep going on. It's like the equivalent of saying, well, no, we're going to force the economy to generate more qualified borrowers, and we're going to force those people to borrow more money at a higher. You can't extend the credit cycle, and they can't.
Let me ask you this. Do you think if Trump wasn't elected, and let's just say Clinton or somebody else was in office, do you think they knew that the Federal Reserve System, the central bank system around the world, they knew that growth was going to come to a screeching halt eventually. Because we're in this gigantic illusionary economy. Do you think what we're seeing right now is the implosion of a central bank economy because they don't have an event to cover it up? Because if there was someone else in office, things might be very, very different. We might see, or we might have gone into a war or something like that, and that would have covered up a lot of this. Do you think what we're seeing now, and maybe Trump is pointing this out by contradicting the Fed, that this is what a central bank system looks like when it is failing and imploding on itself? You think we're witnessing this all in real time right now?
I think you're.
It is failing and imploding on itself. You think we're witnessing this all in real time right now?
I think we are, and I think you're absolutely right. And I'm not sure that any political class can hide this. I mean, like say take China. A lot of people are focusing on China. A lot of people think that China is going to be the world-beating economy, that the U.S. is going to be toast and surpassed by China. But other people are saying, well, look at the statistics coming out of China where growth is really slowing. I mean, like their auto sales have plummeted, smartphone sales have plummeted, and some of the economists there have said that they think that growth is actually negative, or more like 1%, not the advertised 6.5%. And of course, they are immediately censored. I mean, they're the video of their presentation is immediately taken off, and so imploding. And the political class is attempting to mask this decay by whatever means it has. And so censorship in China is one way. Here we have this fake narrative that you described, that it's the recession isn't going to happen for another year, and what's the point there? Well, I guess at a very basic level, it's to convince you to keep borrowing and spending, right? Because if you suddenly feel like your income's at risk, well, then you might pull in your horns and decide not to buy the new car. And then we will get a recession. So there's a sort of self-referential element to it. But yeah, I think they're really, as we were talking about with the yellow vests, I think the political leadership or the financial elites, they're in a kind of a panic desperation mode here. And if we go back to 2016, China was slowing then. It was an election year, and the central banks did a coordinated mass injection of liquidity, right? Bank of Japan, Bank of China, the European Central Bank, and the Federal Reserve all dumped money and liquidity into the global financial system, and their balance sheet shot up. And then the recession that should have happened then the can was kicked forward till now. And so now they're trying the same game, but it doesn't seem to be having the same effect, because there's nobody left to borrow money that isn't going to default. So that game's over.
So is this going to be the same type of recession that we saw back in 2008, or is this going to be something different?
Well, that's a great question, Dave, and I'm glad you asked, because my theory is that this recession is going to be very uneven. In other words, it really depends on where you are in the country, what sector you work in, and what exposure you have to debt, and those elements are going to come together in a kind of dynamic way. And so some households, those with low debt, and they're in a more reliable, less speculative part of the economy, they might do just fine through this coming recession. But other people with high debt, and they're in bubble economies like Seattle, the Bay Area, New York City, they're going to be exposed to a lot more risk of like job loss and massive destruction of capital, right? Like the house they thought was guaranteed to be worth $1 million is suddenly only worth 700 or whatever. And so it's going to be a very uneven experience. That's one of the thoughts I had, that the other recessions, like the one in 2000, 2001, that was really a tech, a dot-com thing that destroyed a lot of sort of fake wealth in the tech sector, but it didn't really impact the rest of the economy. It destroyed a lot of sort of fake wealth in the tech sector, but it didn't really impact the rest of the economy too severely. But the one in 2008-9 was like across the entire financial system, and so it really did impact the entire country. And so I think the lesson from those two things is this recession is going to be a financial based one. So it's going to be more like 2008. In other words, it's going to impact the entire economy. It's not just going to blow up one sector.
Well, last time in 2008, we had, 10 trillion worth of debt. Now we're up to almost 22 trillion. It's probably a lot more than that. And if there's no one left to borrow, what happens to the credit cycle? What happens to the financial system on Wall Street where they lend out money? I mean, is that all going to come to a screeching halt? And if that comes to a screeching halt, then what happens?
The statistics from that era, the 2008, 2009 kind of global financial melt by 90% very quickly. In other words, because that's how our economy is set up now, right? I mean, it's like in the old days, then the bank took deposits, it took your savings and then it loaned it out and it was stable. But now, of course, as we know, that it's very highly leveraged. They borrow short-term money and lend it out longer term. That's the game now, right? They don't need actual cash or deposits. And so what that does is it creates a very short-term mentality where, if you can't make a profit like right now doing this trade or this loan or this bond, then you pull in your horns and don't do anything, right? Because you don't want to lose money. And so we could see that kind of really rapid collapse of speculative lending and bond trading and stock market speculation and real estate speculation. And so that's where, former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, when people asked him, well, how come you didn't see this coming, right? Then his sort of excuse or explanation was, he said, I didn't realize how quickly liquidity can dry up in the market. In other words, everything looks normal, and then suddenly there's no buyers for any of this stuff because nobody wants to lose money, and so then there's no market. In other words, what we say in the markets is the bid disappears. The seller can't find anybody to take it off their hands, and so that's how I'm kind of expecting this next recession to unfold. Is the bid goes away. There's no buyers for anything because people don't want to lose money. So
that means everyone's going to be holding on to their money. And if no one is buying, what do the sellers do? What happens to the whole system then? It just freezes up?
Yeah, or that the few people that the prices can drop by far more than anybody thought, that you have to drop the price a lot before you can find a buyer. And then we might see more of what we saw over the last 5 years, which is central banks starting to buy houses and mortgages and stuff directly, because if there's no private buyer, then who's left to prop the whole thing up? And so then you hear stories out of China where the local government is buying these empty flats and new developments. They're buying the new apartments, the condos, because there's no private buyers. And if this gets out that there's no buyers at any price, then that could collapse the real estate market, right? So this gets out that there's no buyers at any price, then that could collapse the real estate market, right? So you could see these kinds of sub rosa, like under the surface kinds of attempts to prop up the market by being the buyer of last resort. But I don't think that really doesn't work. Eventually, word gets out, and then people realize, wow, this game is really it's really risky now. The central banks are the only buyers out there, and so it actually detracts from people's confidence in the market once they discover how rigged it is.
So if there's no more buyers and the central bank is buying up everything and people become aware of this, aren't the people going to say, well, this is a central bank system. This system failed and the central bank has to create currency out of thin air to buy this stuff. This is not a real economy right now. Maybe we should get rid of the central banks.
One would hope that would be a conclusion. But people, when things start going south, things start really unraveling, then a lot of people will just be trying to, take benefit themselves, and they may just be hoping the central bank buys their, their inflated value house.
The only reason I bring this up is because Trump continually says, as the Fed raises rates, he keeps we really haven't had a president do this before. Maybe Reagan, maybe going back in time where, John F. Kennedy, but he's really pointing the finger and blaming the Fed. Every time they raise the rates, they're bringing down the stock market. They're going to be the ones who are going to destroy the economy. Maybe by him doing this, by showing everyone that it's the Fed that's doing this, and if the economy comes down, maybe everyone will turn and look at the Fed for bringing down the system and not having the system work properly.
One would hope so, because really what, if in the last decade, the era of the pricing mechanism anymore, right? Like the market's been manipulated by central banks, right? They've lowered interest rates by brute force. They've bought, mortgage-backed securities and treasury bonds and all this other stuff, stocks, in the case of the other central banks. And so the markets, they've lost their sort of self-organizing pricing mechanism, right? And so therefore they can't really be trusted, because it's basically being run by a handful of folks in some secret room somewhere. So you can't really trust that the price has been discovered by the market, by the millions of buyers and sellers in the marketplace. And so the more they try to maintain control of the markets, right, through manipulation or sub rosa buying, they're actually reducing our confidence in the markets and in their own control. So I think you're absolutely right. What they're doing is they're reducing our confidence in the markets and in their own control. So I think you're absolutely right. What they're doing is they're eroding our confidence in their management and in the manipulated markets that they now control.
Charles, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people see your work?
Yeah, please visit me at of2minds.com. There's a lot of free samples of my recent books. So grab the PDF and take a look at it.
Charles, once again, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.